There was a moment when the United States almost disappeared. States were leaving the Union. Families were choosing opposite sides. War was no longer a possibility. It had already begun. And standing in the middle of it all was one man.
Abraham Lincoln, the president who refused to let America die.
The Story Vault. Unlock the Untold.
When people hear the name Abraham Lincoln, most of them think of one thing: the president who ended slavery. And yes, that's a huge part of his story. But here's the thing most people don't realize. When Lincoln became president, ending slavery wasn't the first crisis staring him in the face. The United States itself was falling apart. Imagine waking up one morning and finding out that your country is literally breaking into pieces. Not because of a foreign invasion, not because of a natural disaster, but because your own people have decided they no longer want to be one country. That's the America Lincoln inherited. And for a while, it genuinely looked like the United States might not survive.
Today, it's easy to look at America and assume it was always destined to become one of the world's most powerful nations. But history rarely works that way. Countries aren't guaranteed to survive. Some collapse, some split apart, some disappear altogether. In the 1860s, the United States came frighteningly close to becoming one of them. To understand how that happened, we need to go back to the election of 1860. Lincoln wasn't the obvious choice. In fact, many Americans had never even heard of him a few years earlier. He wasn't born into wealth. He wasn't part of a famous political family. He grew up in a log cabin on the frontier. His childhood was hard. His family struggled to survive. He had very little formal education. Most of what he learned, he taught himself. He borrowed books whenever he could, read by candlelight, and asked questions about everything. People later joked that if you wanted to find young Abraham Lincoln, you should look for the tallest man in town holding a book. Before politics, he worked all kinds of jobs. He split fence rails, worked in a store, served as a postmaster, even spent time as a surveyor. Eventually, he became a lawyer. Not because he went to law school. There wasn't one nearby. He simply read law books until he knew enough to pass the bar. That's almost impossible to imagine today. But that's who Lincoln was. Someone who believed that if he didn't know something, he could learn it. As a lawyer, he became known for something unusual. He wasn't the loudest man in the courtroom. He wasn't the most intimidating either. What made him different was his ability to explain complicated ideas in simple language. Jurors trusted him. Clients trusted him. Even people who disagreed with him often admitted he was honest. That reputation would follow him for the rest of his life. People started calling him Honest Abe. But America was changing. Fast. New states were joining the Union. Factories in the North were growing. Cotton plantations in the South were becoming richer than ever. And one issue seemed to poison every political conversation: slavery. Even among people who opposed slavery, there was deep disagreement about what should happen next. Some wanted it abolished immediately. Others believed change had to come gradually. Many politicians tried to avoid the subject altogether, because every discussion seems to push the country closer to conflict. Lincoln's own position evolved over time, but one thing remained consistent. He believed slavery was morally wrong. He also believed the United States could not remain permanently divided over the issue. In one of his most famous speeches, he said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He wasn't predicting that America would disappear overnight. He was warning that a nation couldn't continue forever, half free and half enslaved. Eventually, something would have to change. At the time, those words shocked people. Some thought he was courageous. Others thought he was dangerous. Then came the presidential election. Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in many southern states. Think about that. A man was running for president, and millions of Americans couldn't vote for him because their states refused to include his name. Even so, he won. Not because everyone loved him, but because the country had become so divided that 4 major candidates split the vote. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States. He celebrated quietly, but in parts of the South, people reacted with fear. To many Southern leaders, Lincoln's election wasn't just a political defeat. They believed it threatened their way of life and the future of slavery in the United States. Within weeks, South Carolina announced it was leaving the Union. Then another state followed, and another. Before Lincoln had even taken the oath of office, 7 southern states had declared that they were no longer part of the United States. It sounds unbelievable, but that's exactly what happened. The crisis grew larger every day. Government buildings in the South were seized. Federal authority was challenged. Military forts suddenly found themselves surrounded. People across the country wondered the same thing. Would there be a compromise? Or was war now unavoidable? Even inside Lincoln's own party, there wasn't agreement on what should happen next. Some wanted to let the southern states go. Others demanded immediate military action. Lincoln hadn't even started his first full day as president, and already every decision carried enormous consequences. There's something else that fascinates me about this moment. History often remembers Lincoln as calm, confident, almost larger than life. But he wasn't a superhero. He was stepping into a job no one had ever faced before. There was no instruction manual for holding a country together when it was tearing itself apart. Every word he spoke was analyzed. Every decision could push the nation closer to peace or closer to war. Then, on March 4th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln stood before the American people to take the presidential oath. His message wasn't one of revenge. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was almost the opposite. He pleaded for unity. He reminded Americans that despite their differences, they were still one people. He hoped, perhaps against the odds, that reason would prevail. But sometimes, history reaches a point where words are no longer enough. Just over a month later, the first shots of the American Civil War would be fired, and the question would no longer be whether the United States could stay together. The question would become how many lives it would cost to keep it that way. Just 39 days after Abraham Lincoln became president, the waiting was over. Before sunrise on April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, a small federal fort sitting in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The bombardment lasted for more than a day. When it ended, the Civil War had begun. What's remarkable is that the battle itself caused very few casualties, but its political impact was enormous. The moment those cannons fired, the argument was over. America wasn't facing a constitutional crisis anymore. It was at war with itself. Think about how strange that sounds. Not America versus Britain, not America versus Germany, not America versus Japan. Americans fighting Americans. Brothers enlisted on opposite sides. Some families watched one son put on a Union uniform, while another wore Confederate gray. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years suddenly found themselves pointing rifles at one another. It was one nation splitting apart from the inside. Lincoln understood something immediately. If the Union accepted secession, the United States might never exist as a single country again. And if one group of states could leave whenever they disagreed with an election, what would stop others from doing the same? To Lincoln, this wasn't only about territory. It was about whether democracy itself could survive. If a lawful election ended with the losing side walking away, what future would the country have? So he made a decision that would define his presidency. The Union would not be dissolved. Not while he was president. That didn't mean he wanted war. In fact, for weeks he searched for ways to avoid one. But once the fighting had begun, he believed preserving the Union had become his highest responsibility. It was a decision that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. And he knew it. At first, many people believed the war would be short. A few months, maybe less. Some even packed picnic baskets to watch the first major battle near Washington. They thought it would be exciting, almost like a public event. Then came the first Battle of Bull Run. The reality shocked everyone. The Union Army retreated in chaos. Civilians fled alongside soldiers. The war wasn't ending. It was only beginning. Lincoln faced a problem few presidents have ever experienced. He wasn't just trying to defeat an enemy. He was trying to defeat fellow Americans without destroying the country he hoped to reunite afterward. Every battle created another question. How do you fight your own people and still imagine living together once it's over? There wasn't an easy answer. The pressure on Lincoln became relentless. Every morning brought new casualty reports. Every evening brought criticism. Some newspapers accused him of being too weak. Others said he was becoming too powerful. Some generals wanted more troops. Others hesitated to act. Members of his own cabinet often disagreed with one another. And through it all, Lincoln had to make decisions, knowing that every order he signed could send thousands of young men into battle. One of the things I admire most about Lincoln is that he never pretended the war was going well when it wasn't. He visited hospitals. He met wounded soldiers. He read letters from grieving families. He understood that behind every number in a military report was someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father. The war wasn't an abstract strategy game. It was personal. But here's something many people don't know. During the early years of the war, ending slavery was not yet the official goal. That surprises a lot of people. Today, we naturally connect Lincoln with emancipation, but in 1861, his primary objective was preserving the Union. He even said that if he could save the Union without freeing any slaves, he would. If saving it required freeing all enslaved people, he would do that instead. His point wasn't that slavery didn't matter. It was that as president, his immediate duty was to save the nation. That statement has been debated ever since. Some see it as political realism. Others believe it reflected the difficult constitutional limits he faced early in the war. As the months passed, something began to change. The war wasn't ending, and slavery, the issue that had divided the country for decades, could no longer be separated from the conflict itself. Enslaved people were escaping to Union lines in growing numbers. Military commanders were asking what to do with them. European governments were watching closely. Public opinion was shifting. Lincoln realized the war America had started was no longer the same war it was fighting. Then came September 1862, the Battle of Antietam. It remains the bloodiest single day in American military history. More than 22,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing in a single day. Just let that sink in for a moment. One day, one battlefield, entire communities changed forever. The Union claimed a strategic victory. Not a perfect one, but enough for Lincoln to act. He had been waiting. Not because he doubted his decision, but because he believed timing mattered. If he announced a major policy after a crushing defeat, it might look like desperation. After Antietam, he believed the moment had finally arrived. Behind closed doors, Lincoln took out a document he had been quietly preparing. It wasn't a battle plan. It wasn't a peace treaty. It was a proclamation. A decision that would transform the meaning of the Civil War and redefine the future of the United States. On January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed one of the most famous documents in American history, the Emancipation Proclamation. Most people hear those words and think that's when slavery ended. But history is a little more complicated than that. The proclamation did not instantly free everyone enslaved person in the United States. It applied to enslaved people in areas that were still under Confederate control, while slavery remained legal in some border states that had stayed with the Union. So if that document didn't immediately free everyone, why is it considered one of the most important presidential decisions ever made? Because it changed the meaning of the war. Until then, many people believed the Civil War was simply about keeping the country together. After the Emancipation Proclamation, the war became something larger. Now it was also about ending slavery. That mattered for reasons Lincoln understood very well. If the Union won, slavery would have no future. And if the Confederacy won, its leaders had made clear that slavery would remain central to their new nation. The conflict had become not only a fight over territory, but over the future of American society. The proclamation had another effect, one that reached far beyond the battlefield. Across Europe, many governments had been watching the Civil War closely. Britain and France had economic ties to the South, especially through cotton. There were people who believed those countries might eventually recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation. But once the Union openly connected its cause to ending slavery, supporting the Confederacy became far more difficult politically. Public opinion mattered, especially in Britain, where many people strongly opposed slavery. Historians still debate exactly how much the proclamation influenced European governments, but most agree it strengthened the Union's diplomatic position at a critical moment. It also changed who could fight for the Union. After the proclamation, black men were increasingly allowed to enlist in the Union Army. By the end of the war, nearly 180,000 black soldiers had served. Think about how extraordinary that was. Many had been born into slavery. Now, they were carrying rifles, wearing Union uniforms, and fighting for a country that had denied them freedom. Thousands would never return home. Their service became part of the Union's path to victory. Even with those changes, the war remained brutal. Victory didn't suddenly become easier. If anything, the fighting grew even more intense. General after general struggled to defeat Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Every month brought more casualties, more funerals, more telegrams beginning with words that every family dreaded. we regret to inform you. Lincoln carried that burden every single day. Visitors often noticed how much he had changed. Photographs taken during the war tell the story without saying a word. The lines on his face grew deeper. His shoulders seemed heavier. He looked older than his years. One visitor remarked that it was as if the war itself had aged him. It's not hard to understand why. Every decision he made was measured in lives. Then, in July 1863, came a turning point. The Battle of Gettysburg. For 3 days, the two armies clashed in Pennsylvania. Around 50,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, captured, or missing. It remains one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on American soil. When the fighting finally ended, the Union had stopped Lee's invasion of the North. Many historians consider Gettysburg a major turning point in the war. Not because it ended the conflict. It didn't. But because it shifted momentum. For the first time, many Americans believed the Union might actually win. A few months later, Lincoln returned to Gettysburg, not for another battle, but for a cemetery. Thousands of soldiers had been buried there. Families gathered to honor those who had died. There were speeches planned. One speaker talked for more than 2 hours. Then, Lincoln stood up. He spoke for about 2 minutes. That's all. Just 2 minutes. Yet those 2 minutes became one of the most famous speeches in history. The Gettysburg Address. What's incredible is how short it is. Less than 300 words. You can read it in just a few minutes. But inside those few words, Lincoln completely reframed the war. He didn't focus on revenge. He didn't celebrate victory. Instead, he reminded the nation that democracy itself was being tested. Whether a government of the people, by the people, for the people, could survive. Those words would echo far beyond the Civil War. They would become part of how Americans understood their country, and they would inspire democratic movements around the world. By the spring of 1865, it was finally happening. After 4 years of war, the Confederacy was collapsing. Cities had fallen. Supply lines were breaking apart. The Southern armies were exhausted. On April 9th, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. For millions of Americans, it felt like the nightmare was finally ending. Church bells rang across northern cities. People poured into the streets. Flags appeared in windows. Strangers hugged each other. The war that had taken so much was finally over. Or so they thought. Lincoln wasn't celebrating the way many people expected. He wasn't talking about revenge. He wasn't calling for punishment. In fact, he was thinking about something much more difficult. How do you put a country back together after its own people have spent 4 years trying to destroy each other? Winning a war is one thing. Winning the peace is something else entirely. Just a month earlier, Lincoln had delivered his second inaugural address. It's one of the most remarkable speeches ever given by an American president. People expected a victory speech. Instead, they heard something surprisingly humble. Lincoln didn't stand there claiming that God had chosen one side over the other. He acknowledged the suffering on both sides. He reflected on the moral weight of slavery. And then he ended with words Americans still quote today. With malice toward none, with charity for all. Think about that for a second.
The bloodiest war in American history was almost over. Hundreds of thousands were dead. And the man leading the winning side was asking the country not to be consumed by hatred. He believed that if the Union was going to survive, it couldn't survive through revenge alone. It had to find a way to heal. We'll never know exactly what Lincoln's Reconstruction plan would have looked like, because only 5 days after Lee surrendered, everything changed. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Lincoln went to Ford's Theater in Washington to watch a play with his wife. For the first time in years, he allowed himself a quiet evening. The audience applauded when he entered. No one imagined they were about to witness one of the most shocking moments in American history. Behind the audience, a well-known actor named John Wilkes Booth quietly made his way toward the presidential box. Booth was a Confederate sympathizer who believed Lincoln had destroyed the South. At around 10:15 p.m., he fired a single shot. The bullet struck Lincoln in the back of the head. Booth jumped onto the stage, shouted a phrase often translated as "thus always to tyrants," and escaped into the night. The theater erupted into chaos. Doctors rushed to the president, but there was nothing they could do. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house. He never regained consciousness. The next morning, April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. He was 56 years old. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton reportedly looked at the room in silence and said, "Now he belongs to the ages." Whether those were his exact words has been discussed by historians, but the sentiment has endured for generations. Because almost immediately, Lincoln stopped being only a president. He became a symbol. What's fascinating is that Lincoln wasn't universally loved while he was alive. Far from it. He was criticized constantly. Newspapers attacked him. Political opponents called him incompetent. Some people thought he was too cautious. Others thought he had gone too far. If social media had existed in 1863, it's hard to imagine Lincoln ever escaping the outrage. And yet, history often judges leaders differently than their own generation does. Today, it's easy to assume everyone agreed Lincoln was one of America's greatest presidents. They didn't. That reputation grew over time. As the country reflected on the Civil War and on what had almost been lost, people began asking a different question. Not, did Lincoln make perfect decisions? Because he didn't. No wartime leader does. Instead, they asked, what would America look like if Lincoln had failed? That's a much harder question. Imagine, for just a moment, that the Union had broken apart forever. Instead of one United States, there are two rival nations on the North American continent. Maybe more. Would they have remained at peace? Would they have become allies? Or would they have fought more wars over borders, trade, and territory? No one knows. History doesn't let us rerun the experiment. But one thing is clear. The United States that emerged as a global power in the 20th century is the same United States that survived the Civil War. Without that victory, the rest of American history might have looked completely different. And that's why Lincoln's story still matters. Not because every problem he faced is the same as today's. They're not. The United States of the 1860s and the United States of today are separated by more than a century and a half of change. But one question continues to appear in different forms. How does a nation stay together
when its people can no longer agree on what that nation should be? Every generation answers that question differently. Maybe that's why people still return to his words, not because they solve every modern disagreement, but because they remind us that even societies under enormous strain can choose what kind of future they want to build. Lincoln understood something that feels just as relevant now as it did then. A country isn't held together only by borders, or laws, or armies. It's held together by whether its people still believe it's worth staying together. And once that belief begins to disappear, no leader, no matter how extraordinary, can save a nation alone.
The Story Vault. Unlock the Untold.